Everyone's looking forward to retirement. It's that mythical time in the future where you get to do what you want. Consequently, people want to retire early. Why? So they can do what they want sooner. It's also something people worry about a lot. Will I have enough money to retire? It's where a financial advisor might suggest what's called the 4% rule. Now, we're going to talk about that a lot, but first I want to talk about something very profound. So there was this lady named Bronnie Ware. She worked as a palliative care nurse for several decades. That means she took care of people who had weeks to live. And during that time, she asked as many people as possible what their regrets were. And she tallied up all the answers and published this blog post that ended up becoming a book. The book's called 5 Regrets, I think. I haven't read it, but here are the top 5, and I've omitted number 1 because we're going to talk about that in a second. But if you ask people to guess what these might be, it'd probably say things like, well, people probably regret working so much. Sure enough, that's in position number 2. People wish they would have stayed in touch with their friends. But the number 1 answer is very profound. I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. So those who truly love what they do are very lucky. But for the rest of us, having to work is a big impediment to living a life true to yourself and doing what you'd like to do with the little time you have here on earth. So forget about retirement for a second. Here's a better question. When can you use the wealth you've accumulated to do what you want, whatever that might be? Another way to phrase that is, when can you safely stop working and know you'll have enough money to live? So that's the 4% rule. Now, there's a famous study called the Trinity study, and the first rendition of that is titled Retirement Savings, Choosing a Withdrawal Rate That is Sustainable. And then they did an update that's well worth a read. It's titled Portfolio Success Rates, Where to Draw the Line. So before we dig into that, I wanted to touch on a very simple rule that all financial advisors will probably talk about. It's the 100 minus your age rule. So, for example, at 65 years old, when most people might retire, you should have 35% in stocks and 65% in bonds. So take your age, 100 minus your age, that's how much you ought to have in stocks. You see, when you're quite young, when you're 20, you ought to have 80% of your money in stocks, etc. Okay. So there's this idea of an allocation, a simple asset class allocation, X% in stocks, X% in bonds. The study keeps it simple, so it focuses on these 2 asset classes. Unsurprisingly, stocks outperform. And when we talk about stocks in this study, they're simply using the S&P 500. You might choose to use a broader market, of course, low-fee ETF, such as we recently covered in our piece on the best ETF. Now, we're trying to answer one simple question. Will I run out of money before I die? Or put otherwise, how much money can I withdraw from my savings as a percentage of the total amount and not run out of money before I die? So let's just do some basic math using the 4% rule and $500,000 in savings. And I used $500,000 because then we can all multiply that by whatever number we need to arrive at where we sit in terms of savings. So here you can see if we had $500,000, we withdrew 4% every year. That would be $20,000 a year or $1,600 a month. Note that this is not 4% of that amount every year, but it's a fixed amount that we're determining at the start. So if the market stays flat, here's how many years you'd have. You take $500,000, divide it by $20,000, that's the 4%, you got 25 years. So assuming you retire at 65, you better hope you don't live past 90. How long are you supposed to live? Well, that's called life expectancy, and this is a great listing of various life expectancies. At the top there, you'll see Hong Kong. That's why I moved there, so that I can live longer. So let's assume, for the sake of today's video, that everyone lives to 80 and retires at 65. So 30 years really ought to do it. Now, before we get into talking about the Trinity study, I just wanted to ask your help. Please subscribe if you're not already subscribed to this channel and support our work. It takes 2 seconds to click that button. If you're already subscribed, please share this with a parent, a child, a sibling. That way they won't come to you asking for money later on when they have a retirement where they run out of money. This will teach you not to run out of money in retirement. So here's the Trinity study in a nutshell. And these tables are taken from that second variation of the study published in 2011. They've used a massive amount of data here from January 1926 through December 2009. They use what's called a Monte Carlo analysis. And what they're trying to do here very simply is say, what's the chances that I won't run out of money? So let's take the first table there at the top that says 100% stocks. You see that on the left? And then below that it says 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, 25 years, whatever. And then you go to the right and you see the percentage that you're withdrawing. So if you withdraw 3%, there's a 100% likelihood that in 30 years you're going to have not run out of money. Okay, simple. Now when we go to 4%, meaning you're taking out more money every year, you see that the likelihood of running out in 30 years starts to, let's say the likelihood of not running out starts to decrease, you see. So if you go all the way to the right, if you're withdrawing 12% of your savings every year, there's a 35% chance that in 30 years you won't have run out of money. Now, there's a couple interesting things to note. So you can pause this and really look this over so it becomes intuitive, because it really is. I wanted to point to, first of all, 4%. So you see here, withdrawing 4% from whatever mix you have, whether that's 100% stocks or 50% stocks, 50% bonds, or 100% bonds, you're going to, with a 98% chance, not run out of money. That's the 4% rule in a nutshell right there. Now look over at 7%. Oh, of course, there's a couple interesting, the likelihood is increasing because you're withdrawing more money, but there's a couple interesting things here. First of all, notice how the two categories, you have 100% stocks and 75% stocks, 25% bonds. Notice how when you throw bonds into the mix, you actually have a better chance of not running out of money. Look at 30 years on those two categories. So 100% stocks, there's an 87% chance you won't run out of money. And if you add 25% bonds, there's a 91% chance you won't run out of money. So it's important to pay attention to that. The other thing I wanted to note here is that generally speaking, they say you shouldn't go below 85% likelihood. So if you start going below that, then you're taking some risk there that you might run out of money. But people are going to correctly point out here, what about inflation? So inflation really is the silent killer. So every 30 years, your purchasing power is going to halve. So that means that if you're withdrawing that fixed amount, your quality of life is going to halve in 30 years. That doesn't sound very good, right? So that's the problem with fixed income. It's fixed, and that's why we developed our own dividend growth strategy, Quantigence, which solves that problem. Nothing like not touching your capital and having a raise every single year. So at a minimum, when we think about the 4% rule, we need to adjust those withdrawals for inflation. So let's do that. My, how the numbers have changed. So 4% is still good, going back to the 4% rule, right? But look when we move up to 5%, how dramatically that changes. So in 30 years, there's a 20% likelihood that you'll run out of money. And then, of course, you see that's with the 5% column there. You see how if you throw bonds into the mix, then it goes, there's an 18% chance you'll run out of money. So just that. It seems the mix of 75% stocks, 25% bonds seems to offer you an advantage there. So now you can see why when you start moving upwards from 4%, things start to become problematic. Going back to that rule that says, well, you shouldn't go below an 85% likelihood of not running out of money. So this from RBC Wealth Management is a great table that shows you how there's variations on this. So the 4% rule is really simple. You set it and forget it on a 100% historical success rate with a 30-year time horizon. You increase that income every year by inflation. The investments are simply S&P 500 and a government bond index, etc. And then on the right, they show you a dynamic approach. So again, targeting that 85 to 95%. changing the values over time, right? So, and we're going to talk about that. Now, a couple things to note here. First of all, the perfect storm. So, what about the perfect storm of 2008 when almost all securities declined in value? Well, they say that during that time, clients are likely to focus on preserving the portfolio while still withdrawing some funds for support. So the implication here is that in a sustained bear market, you might reduce your withdrawal amounts to no more than the dividend, because the SPY ETF or any S&P 500 ETF is going to, or fund, pay dividends. We did a recent piece on the snowball effect that looked at how significant those are over time. So they say, well, in a really difficult time, just reduce what you're withdrawing. Well, that requires some real budgeting. So they say planning budgets in retirement and allocation to liquid assets should include the possibility of such market conditions. So what studies show going forward from the Trinity study, additional academic research focuses on revising those withdrawal amounts. And they say here also portfolio asset allocations. Be careful there. So you don't want to get into the business of trying to time the market, and that's what happens when you get involved with that. But they say here that some authors advise adjusting to lower real withdrawal amounts when the real or inflation-adjusted portfolio values decline, and they suggest a plan to increase withdrawals when the portfolio increases. And then there's this bullet point here. Perhaps you ought to consider withdrawing a constant percentage of a moving average value of the portfolio. And then they start talking about throwing inflation into the mix. So let's not make things overly complicated. We're going to talk about a much simpler way to apply the 4% rule. So that goes back to living the life you want. Life shouldn't start at 65. And this whole FIRE movement is all about, saving up so that you can retire early. Well, it doesn't need to involve eating ramen noodles. You can have a good quality of life and retire early, provided that you're saving consistently over time. Big question, how do you know if you can retire early? Well, it's time to start running some numbers. So when you think about traditional retirement, there's different components of income shown in this table. So you have, for example, Social Security if you're in the States, a pension if you're lucky enough to have one from your employer, and then whatever income you need after that is what you're concerned with generating. Now, prior to age 65, those first two elements, Social Security and pension, aren't on the table. So let's say you want to stop working at 45 years old. Well, that's an additional 20 years you need to cover in addition to the 30 years we require if we live to 95. So you're at 50 years. How can we safely assume we don't run out of money in 50 years? Well, here's what we would propose, the new 4% rule. Trim X% of your portfolio every year. We say that because it may not necessarily be 4%. In good years, you sock some away as a buffer. In bad years, you utilize your buffer, and guess what? You're never going to run out of money. It takes that fear away. What's even better is that you're taking more off the table in good times and less during bad times. So one of the problems that investors had during 2008 or the dot-com crisis is that when they were at retirement and their money was halved, they were like, damn, now I need to start selling my assets at an all-time low. So that's not very good. Now, when we think about 4% versus other percentages, what happens is that when you increase the percent using this strategy, the cash flows become more volatile. We're going to take a look at that. It's quite cool. First, let's look at how 4% looks. And we use this tool from SRL Global. It's really slick. You can go there and use it yourself. I think you have to give them an email address, and then you have full access to be able to do this. We simply used SPY. We started out with that $500,000, as we mentioned before. We're withdrawing 4% of whatever the portfolio happens to be every year, and we're reinvesting dividends. And that's because that's how the tool works. You have to select dividends reinvested, but it doesn't really matter. On the right, then, you see a couple interesting things. So first of all, the table on the right, go to the very bottom, you see 2003. So that's the time frame we're using between 2003 and 2023, so 20 years. that first year, the $500,000 would have increased 28%. That was the market's return, SPY's return. So you take that new value, $615,000, 245, right? You multiply that by 4%, you get $25,000, 635. So that's your income. Then you start going up and you see that in 2023, that original principal has nearly tripled, and so has your cash flows, which is rather interesting. So here's what that income looks like over time. And of course, that's at the same rate your portfolio is growing. So your income is growing at 5% compound annual growth rate. That's enough to solve for inflation. So, and the other thing to note here is look in 2008, right? We talked about that. Look at that dip. So you would have went from $30,000 in income to $20,000. This goes back to the point about budgeting and socking away in good times. Now, let's say that you wanted to increase that withdrawal rate to 8%. Well, everything changes pretty dramatically. First of all, the biggest problem is that your income and portfolio, so those two growth rates, are matched because you're taking a fixed percentage every year. They're growing at less than 1% CAGR. So your quality of life is actually decreasing over time. And the other thing to note here, when we put these two withdrawal rates side by side, in the 2008 crisis, look how long it took for the 8% withdrawal plan to go back to its original $50,000. It took all the way until 2018. When you look on the right, the 4% withdrawal rate, that recovered very quickly. In a matter of, looks like about 5 years. So when suggesting this plan to investors, they have a concern around the variable income stream. And the response to that is just be better at budgeting. So whatever core stock ETF you're holding is likely going to produce a stream of dividend income that also needs to be considered. The example that we gave you, that's being reinvested. You can reinvest it or keep it. That just means if you keep it, the percentage that you need to withdraw every year decreases. So that dividend income, as we showed in our recent piece in the snowball effect, grows over time at a pace that exceeds inflation, generally speaking. Depends on what ETF you're using, right? Or what index you're tracking, more importantly. But that dividend income could also be put into a buffer account or reinvested, as we did in our example. And then what you can do is adjust your percent withdrawal based on how well the year went. So what does that mean? It means you're avoiding selling assets during recessionary periods. Most important thing, you're never going to run out of money. Now, you'll need a disciplined budget to do this. And if you're doing it earlier in life, then just remember at age 65 or whatever age you retire, you're going to get those additional income streams kicking in. So your Social Security or pension, 401ks, things like that. So if you're from a foreign country, as half our audience is, then just substitute your equivalent there, whatever retirement age. There's a whole different conversation. But back when I did my MBA, we had a lot of students from countries that, let's say, where they didn't necessarily want to go back. And a lot of these folks, they'd say, well, I want to live here in the UK and I want to work as an investment banker and make a whole ton of money. Well, I always told them this, and this is the advice that I give recent graduates. Choose one from these three criteria. So if you really want to live in the UK, you better get any job you can find. If the role is the most important to you, you better be able to relocate and take low pay. If highest pay is most important, you better be able to relocate and take any role that offers the highest pay. So similar for retirees, things to consider: location you want to retire, cheapest place to retire, best lifestyle possible. Those last two bullet points are related. Is it possible to have all three? It certainly is, especially if you're willing to use geographical arbitrage. So your money goes a lot further in various countries around the world. So consider that when you're looking at your 4% income. Now, just a question for the class. What downsides can you think of for this new 4% rule that doesn't take a fixed amount, but rather a percentage over time of the portfolio? Put that in the comments section, please. And in the meantime, I'm going to leave you with another very interesting video on the snowball effect. This will show you how to create some serious wealth over time for those of you that have time to do that. Please make sure to subscribe to our channel. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this today.